Yes, our subject today is a settlement divided, and I think it's particularly appropriate for a couple of reasons. One, of course, 2025 kicks off our years-long commemoration of the Revolutionary War. Um, we'll be talking more about that a little bit later on, but also you'll hear a lot more about it in the weeks and months to come. Uh, but it's also, I think, a pertinent and appropriate topic because of the fact that we hear so often today the sentiment that our country is so divided, we've never been so divided, et cetera, et cetera. And I always kind of chuckle when I hear that, not that it's um, totally untrue that we are a very divided country today, but because of the fact that I think we've always been a very divided country. There are very rare times when we seem to unite behind any one cause. And of course, that dates back to the very beginning of the of the country. The years leading up to the Revolutionary War saw a great division in the country. I'm not sure about you, but when I was growing up and studying history in school and probably right on through high school and until I got to college, the notion that we seemed to be given was that there were Tories or Loyalists in the country, but there were uh, only a few of them, and that they really didn't have much of an impact on the war. At least that's kind of the impression that I always had growing up. But um, that's very distorted. There probably were more loyalists in the country, at least in the early years um, of the war, than there were patriots. At least people who firmly uh, believed in separation from England. So these political differences not only divided the settlement of Cushetunk, but they were representative of what was happening in the country as a whole. And also, I think what makes them even more important from a local point of view is the fact that they actually led to the demise of the Cushetunk settlement, the first permanent European settlement in the upper Delaware Valley. By 1785, the settlement of Cushetunk, as it had been known for about 30 years, ceased to exist. And that was directly because of the divisions in the Revolutionary War. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I thank you all for taking the time to be part of the program today. And as Donna said, when I'm through with the slides, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. So if you don't mind, please hold them to the end. So let's first talk a little bit about Cushetunk so you understand what it is when we use the term. Um, Although this area, the Upper Delaware region, and pretty much all of what would become Sullivan County, we're well into Ulster County and beyond, as late as the middle part of the 18th century, was still uh, a wilderness. There was very little here. It was a route that people used, trappers and Native Americans commonly used the Sun Trail and routes along the Delaware River to travel from place to place. But this area, in and of itself, was pretty much a wilderness. There wasn't much here. Meanwhile, in eastern Connecticut, a couple of things were happening. One, farmland was becoming scarce, and people who wanted to own their own farms, and this was kind of part of the English culture to kind of aspire to own your own property, and that's one of the things that spurred people to leave England for North America. But also there was uh, this interest in investing and the notion that one could become wealthy by investing in property and reselling it. And so these companies were formed not just to resettle, but also to provide opportunities for investors. And so we see the Susquehanna Company, for example, which was formed specifically to purchase land along the Susquehanna River in northeastern Pennsylvania. And you have to understand that at that point in time, the colony of Connecticut, and we're talking now the mid 1750s, the colony of Connecticut believed that it owned all of the land far into the west. Their charter, granted by King Charles, was very ambiguous, and this was not unusual for colonial charters. The boundaries of many of the colonies were very uncertain, unspecific. And so Connecticut claimed all of this land well into Pennsylvania and beyond into Ohio. Some of you may be aware that there's a section of Ohio to this day that's known as the Western Reserve. And back in the 18th century, the Western Reserve was claimed by Ohio. And a good portion of northeastern Pennsylvania, rather by Connecticut. And a good portion of northeastern Pennsylvania was also claimed by Connecticut. And in fact, Connecticut and Pennsylvania end up going to war over that land. The Pennamite Yankee Wars, probably three separate wars, were fought over the ownership of that property. So the Susquehanna Company was one group of investors, and a second group was called the Delaware Company. The Susquehanna Company purchases the land from some local Native Americans in northeastern Pennsylvania, and the Delaware Company purchases land along the Delaware River, again, from a group of Native Americans who remained in this area. So by the 1750s, most of the Native Americans who had lived here, the Lenape or the Delaware, as the British referred to them, they had left. They had left the area. They had been fighting wars with the Six Nations, primarily the Seneca, for probably hundreds of years. They were also uncomfortable about the growing presence of Europeans in the area. And so by about 1730, we begin to see the Lenape, the Delaware, moving farther west. Although there were a number of stragglers who remained in the area, for the most part, as an organized presence, the Lenape or the Delaware had left the area. But there were a number of chieftains who still signed this deed to turn over two separate purchases by this group called the Delaware Company. And although there were about 30 families that initially settle here, the number of investors was far greater than that. There are more than probably more than 100 investors. But by 1757, they had formed a settlement here they called Cushetunk, and it really was divided into three separate settlements up and down the Delaware River. The entire purchase was about 30 miles in length, probably 8 or 10 miles deep on either side of the Delaware. So we're talking about the New York side and the Pennsylvania side, all claimed by Connecticut, and they call the area Cushetunk, which was sort of the English version of the Native American word for this region. And that's the Cushetunk settlement. We have the deeds. We have copies of the deeds. They have survived, and we have the marks by various Native American chieftains, Nudimus, Alamasayet, Mataland, and several others. We have their marks on the deeds. And we'll talk more about the deeds a little bit later because there's some interesting names among the Europeans who signed as well. So this group of about 30 families come here and they settle along the Delaware, and they're mostly farmers. They come here to farm, and they take advantage of the very fertile ground near the river. And by 1760, largely because the French and Indian War is still going on, they have constructed some fortifications, and they build what was known as the Upper Fort, which was up near present-day Callicoon, and the Lower Fort, which is what is approximated today by our recreation at Fort Delaware. They also had a blockhouse. So they were just looking to protect themselves from the hostilities of the French and Indian War. But primarily they were occupying themselves as farmers. Um, this is a map created by James W. Burbank when he created Fort Delaware to show where the families lived. And he lists 18 of the families here. There were several others um, who lived in the area initially. Many of them were lost in 1763 when the part of the settlement at 10 Mile River was destroyed by a war party of Native Americans. But you can see some of the family names. We'll get back to this in a bit as well. But for many years, these settlers live in harmony and they depend upon each other to survive the harsh life on the frontier. So, for example, if your crops failed one year and you're starving, your neighbors would help you by providing food. This was a fairly common occurrence, and we see this happen even more often once we get into the 1760s and the timber rafting industry begins to take hold here. People saw the great riches that could be made by cutting timber and rafting it down the Delaware to Philadelphia and other points south. And so oftentimes this idea of getting rich very quickly by rafting timber preoccupied the settlers. And sometimes we see them neglecting their crops and their crops as a result fail. And so maybe they lose their timber raft in the rapids or some mishap on the river, and they have nothing to show for this weeks or months of work that they devoted to the timber, neglecting their crops. And so they have nothing to show for their work. Their crops have failed, and they depend upon their neighbors for their very survival. So this was a fairly common occurrence for many years. These settlers needed each other in order to survive on the frontier. But as the Revolutionary War approaches, the country's becoming more and more divided. And we see factions developing, those that remain very loyal to Great Britain, those who are adamant about independence, and a great number of people who are sort of caught in the middle. And what we see happening at Cushetunk is that the families are really forced to choose up sides. And we have, as fate would have it, a far greater number of loyalists, although here, this is a map of Cushetunk and some of the family names that we've really been able to research in depth. And you see, we've listed here 7 families that were loyalists and 7 who were patriots. But there were a far greater number of loyalists at Cushetunk as the war is approaching than there were patriots. And so what we find happens is that if you were a patriot living in Cushetunk at that time, uh, you found it unsafe here. And so most of the patriots move on. Some go back to Connecticut, to Eastern Connecticut, where they were from originally. Others, and more of them, I would say, move to nearby communities, Minisink, Goshen, downriver, where there are more patriots. And so the settlement, the Cushetunk settlement, as it had been constructed, is left in the hands of the Loyalists. And this is true on both sides of the river. The Loyalists remain, the Patriots, for the most part, have left, um, although they do come back. And the atrocities that we find on both sides throughout the entire war are they're really unbelievable. I think they would stun most people. But just take a look at some of the family names, and some of these names are very um, prominent even to this day. So the Skinner family, of course, we have Skinner's Falls. We have the Tylers. We have Tyler Hill, Pennsylvania. Many of these names have continued in the area. We're going to talk about just a few of them, but this is an idea of how the settlement divides up. So if we look at some of the names here, on the Patriot side, Bezaleel Tyler III, Moses Thomas II, they're not only patriots, they're patriots who give their life during the war. They both are killed at the Battle of Minisink. Oliver Calkin, whose father, by the way, both Bezaleel Tyler and Moses Thomas are part of the founding family of Cushetunk. Oliver Calkin's father, John, was an original settler here as well. John Calkin was the first medical doctor in the Cushetunk settlement. Oliver Calkin fights for the Patriot side at the Battle of Minisink. He survives, unlike Moses Thomas and Bezaleel Tyler. And on the Loyalist side, we have Joseph Ross and Bryant Kane. We have the Lands, um, and both one of the Lamb boys and Joseph Ross, Bryant Kane. They're all they fight at Minisink for the Loyalists. So it's quite a division in the settlement. Let's talk a little bit about a few of those people. Daniel Skinner, who is the son of one of the founders of the settlement, Joseph Skinner. Joseph Skinner is murdered in 1759, by the way. To this day, we're not sure who killed him, but his family, 14 children, continued to live in the settlement. And as was fairly common during the Revolutionary War, and as an example of how the Revolutionary War is really very much a civil war when we look at it carefully. The Skinner family was divided during the war. So Daniel Skinner and his brother Haggai, for example, were avowed loyalists. They wanted to remain um, part of the British Empire, but their brother Abner actually enlisted and fought with the Continental Army. So the Skinner family was divided. The Tylers and the Thomases um, were patriot families. Both Bezaleel Tyler III, Moses Thomas II, as I said, killed at the Battle of Minisink. Robert Land, the Land family were loyalists. Robert Land was the justice of the peace in the settlement, appointed by the British government. So probably no mystery that he would remain loyal to the British government. He had fought for England during the French and Indian War, and when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he initially joins up with Joseph Brant, the Mohawk, who is allied with the British. But eventually, because of his knowledge of the terrain and the territory, he begins to carry dispatches. He becomes a courier and a spy for the British. His son John Land is a British loyalist, and he is one of the few loyalists who remain in the area after the war. If you had taken up arms against the colonies in the war, you were not permitted to stay. You were an enemy combatant, and they all end up going to Canada or to England. But since John Land spends most of the war in prison, he never takes up arms. He's allowed to stay, and he remains in the area in the Cushetunk settlement after the war. Continues to farm here, even though he's taunted by his neighbors for the rest of his life as John the Tory. We also have Joseph Ross, who's a well-known loyalist, and he becomes an ally of Joseph Brant, accompanies him on the raids of the settlement. So we're going to talk more about that as we move forward here. Let's talk a little bit about Robert Land, who I think is a very fascinating character. So, as I said, Robert Land was the justice of the peace in the settlement. He had come to America back in the 1730s with his brother, and he eventually settles along the Delaware at the confluence of Calkins Creek. He's on the Pennsylvania side of the river. He marries a woman named Phoebe Scott, and they eventually have 7 children. He fought for the British during the French and Indian War, as I said. He becomes the local justice of the peace or magistrate, one of the most respected of the Cushetunk settlers. Um, but his role in the French and Indian War and his knowledge of the area leads him to become a spy uh, for the British after his time with Brant. So he begins to carry dispatches for the British. And he's a very active spy, um, traveling between Long Island and Niagara and all the points in between, carrying dispatches for General Clinton, for the British general. And because he's active and because he's well known, he's captured by the Americans more than once. He manages to escape each time. One particular time, he's captured, he's court martialed, and he's sentenced to be hanged. And on the day that he is to be hanged, a letter arrives. His captors were uh, Colonel Oliver Spencer and his what was known as additional regiment. But Spencer's regiment were the captors of Robert Land. And on the very day that Land is to be hanged as a spy, a letter arrives from George Washington himself. And in the letter, which has survived, we actually have copies of the letter. And interestingly, it's not in Washington's hand, although it's signed George Washington. We believe that it's actually written by Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's chief aide. But in the letter, Washington is very explicit that as a civilian, Robert Land should not have been court-martialed. He's not subject to military justice, and he cannot be hanged. So Washington orders that he be held over for a civilian trial. And in order to hold him over for a civilian trial, they transfer Robert Land to a jail in Easton, Pennsylvania, and he's able to escape. But they pursue him in his escape, and they actually shoot him while he's running away. And they see him fall. They hit him. They actually shoot him in the back, and they see him fall. What they don't realize is that Robert Land was carrying many of his belongings in a knapsack, and so even though he's shot and the musket ball knocks him down, it doesn't actually wound him. He's knocked down, but he's not wounded. However, when he falls, he gashes his hand on a jagged rock. And because he's been running and his heart's pounding, because he's literally escaping for his life, he bleeds profusely. And so when his captors reach the point where he fell, where they saw him fall, they see all of this blood. And they pursue him, but they don't locate his body. He's managed to crawl off and hide. But they see all this blood and they reason anyone who was wounded, and we saw him hit, we saw him fall, that they couldn't possibly survive. And so they believe Robert Land has been killed. And the story spreads that Robert Land is dead. And the news reaches his family, his wife, Phoebe, and his children back here in the Cushetunk settlement, that Robert Land has been killed. And so they believe he's dead. Now, as fate would have it, just a short time later, many of those patriots who had left the settlement and had moved downriver to Minisink and to Goshen, they were parts of the committees of safety that were formed to protect the settlements from Brant and his men and other loyalist incursions. And they would occasionally visit the Cushetunk settlement and seek reprisals against the loyalist families here. And at one point in time, they, under the leadership of Bezaleel Tyler III, they returned to Cushetunk. They attack some of the families who remained here. And they actually murder the family of the loyalist Bryant Kane. The men of the Loyalist families knew that this was going to happen from time to time. And so they tried to stay away from their families as much as possible, believing that if they were not around, their families would be safe. This was a miscalculation because one night this party of patriots attacked the Kane family and murdered them in their home. And they then crossed the river. Directly across from the Canes was the home of Robert Land. And they crossed the river to the Land home with the intention of murdering the Land family and burning their home. By the way, this is a copy of the letter from George Washington to Oliver Spencer, who was head of Spencer's regiment. And you can, I don't know if you can read it, but if you can, you can make out, here's the text of it, that Land is not to be hanged. At any rate, they crossed the river with the intention of killing the Land family and burning their home as well. But the Land family is warned by a local Native American who happens to be friendly with one of the Land daughters. He actually wakes her up in the middle of the night and warns her that these men are coming to burn their home and to murder them. And so she's able to rally the family, and her mother, Phoebe Land, is able to get her children out of the house. And they literally hide in the cornfield. And they watch these men, not strangers, but men they know well, their former neighbors, burn their house to the ground. But no one knows that they've escaped. And so the local people believe that the Land family, like the Canes, have been killed. And Phoebe Land is shrewd enough to realize that that's probably not a bad thing, because if they believe that they're dead, they'll stop pursuing them. And so she's able to secret the family away. And they actually make their way to New York City, uh, and they survive the war. But the news spreads that the Land family and the Kane family have been killed. And the news reaches Robert Land, who's out spying for the British, that his family's been killed. And he actually makes a detour on one of his spy journeys back here through the settlement. And he sees that his house has been burned to the ground. And so he believes that his family's dead. They think he's dead. And the remainder of the war passes with each of them believing that the other is dead. 11 years, in fact, go by, and one version of the story is that 11 years later, the war is long over. Robert Land has been living in Canada. He's been given a land grant for his service to the British in Canada, and he's living actually at the head of Lake Ontario for a number of years. And Phoebe eventually gets her family to Canada, as most loyalists eventually end up in Canada, all except her oldest son, John. They make their way to Canada. And when they get into the vicinity of what is today the city of Hamilton, Ontario, someone mentions to them that there's a man named Land living at the mouth of the lake. They say, "Oh, your name is Land? We've had a man by that name living at the mouth of the lake. Maybe he's related to you. You should go visit him." So Phoebe Land doesn't really believe that this is the case because she thinks her husband's been dead for many years. But she decides to at least investigate. She takes two of her boys and they go visit this man. And as they're walking up the path to this kind of reclusive, deserted cabin, this rundown cabin, they see a man on the porch smoking his pipe. And as they get a little bit closer, they realize it's Robert Land. And after 11 years, the family is actually reunited um, against all odds. So that's one of several great stories about the Land family. And actually, I've compiled some of these stories together, and Um, this is just sort of the text of what I've just told you. Um, John Land, meanwhile, as I said, after the war, he refuses to leave. And he returns here to the settlement and continues to work the family farm for the rest of his life, even though he's known as John the Tory. And the John Land home still stands in Milanville, Pennsylvania. It's one of the oldest homes in the area. But there are great stories surrounding Robert Land and his family throughout the war. And I've actually got a book coming out later this year called The Cushetunk Spy. And it's the life story of Robert Land. So keep an eye out for that. It's sometime later this year, we're going to have that book out, The Cushetunk Spy. So these divisions split the settlement, and they really come to a head at the Battle of Minisink, as I said, where we have actually neighbors from the Cushetunk settlement fighting against one another. We have Bezaleel Tyler and Moses Thomas and Oliver Calkin fighting with the militia on the Patriot side. We have Joseph Ross and probably one of the land boys fighting on the Loyalist side, and actually, looking to kill one another. We don't know exactly if they end up fighting literally hand to hand against each other, but we know that the Battle of Minisink devolves into hand to hand combat, and that the Patriots who were killed at the battle, we think 46 of them are actually killed um, by someone bludgeoning them to death with a tomahawk or shooting them with a musket. But the vast majority of them, certainly those who are killed at Hospital Rock, are killed in hand-to-hand combat, including Benjamin Tustin. Um, so that's sort of the peak of the conflict. But this neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother continues throughout the war. And so when the war ends in 1783, if you've been on the Loyalist side, which most of the remaining Cushetunk settlers were, you now have to leave the country. And most of them end up fleeing to Canada. And so by 1785, what was known as the Cushetunk settlement basically ceases to exist. Although Robert Land's son John remains, very few of the settlers remain here. Now, eventually, some of those patriots begin to trickle back and reclaim their family farms. But in terms of the settlement as it was originally constituted, it ceases to exist. So these divisions during the war literally destroyed the Cushetunk settlement as we knew it. So, as many of you know, the story of the Cushetunk settlement is the stories that those stories are what are told at Fort Delaware. And Fort Delaware is a reproduction of what was mentioned earlier as the lower fort. The lower fort and the upper fort were two stockades that were built around portions of the settlement, primarily to protect the settlers during the French and Indian War. They were not used during the Revolutionary War. Uh, Although Joseph Brant and his band of loyalists um, attacked the settlements on the frontier, the Cushetunk settlement does not get attacked during the Revolutionary War. So there's no need for these fortifications. Why? Because it was well known as a loyalist settlement. So where Peenpack and Minisink um, and other settlements on the more eastern part of the frontier at Pine Bush and so on, they're attacked by Brant and his men as Patriot strongholds. Um, Cushetunk does not get attacked. So Fort Delaware is a reproduction of of a fortification that's used earlier in the settlement's life, not during the Revolutionary War. But the stories that we tell at Fort Delaware are the stories of the Cushetunk settlement. 2 years ago, we actually got a grant to help us put together an interactive exhibit, which you see here, which is called A Settlement Divided. And that map that you saw earlier is reproduced in this electronic interactive exhibit. You can see it there. Apologize for the poor quality of that photo. The light has created a glare there, but you'll see on the blue side are the Patriot families, the red side are the Loyalists, and you can literally touch on one of the family names, and it will take you to another screen where it will explain to you that family's leanings during the war. We have more information about some of the families than others, but perhaps why they chose to be Patriots or Loyalists, and what ultimately happens to the family. So we have 14 of the families that we've been able to research in earnest, and this has become quite a popular exhibit. And I might mention that while Fort Delaware is closed during the off season, uh, we've uh, we have relocated this exhibit to the Sullivan County Museum in Hurleyville. The Historical Society, Sullivan County Historical Society, has agreed to host it throughout the winter months. So you can go to the museum and actually see this if you haven't made your way to Fort Delaware yet to see the exhibit. And this will give you an idea of how and why these families were divided during the war. There are some interesting stories that we're still developing about the Cushetunk settlement during the Revolutionary War, and even about its initial settlement. And one of them involves this gentleman here. I'm not sure if you recognize the face, but he's one of the most well-known uh, characters of the Revolutionary War. This is a picture of the great trader, the General Benedict Arnold. And one of the stories that we're currently developing, you'll be among the first to hear this, is the role that Benedict Arnold and his family played in the settlement of Cushetunk. And if you uh, visit Fort Delaware this coming year, you'll actually see and hear this story developing. So, just to give you the broad strokes, as I mentioned earlier, the Cushetunk settlement was the result of two land purchases by these investors from Connecticut, from eastern Connecticut. So the area around Norwich and Preston, Windham, Connecticut, uh, this is where the settlers originated. And these two purchases were made um, from these Native American sachems or chieftains. And there's among the European signers, these Norwich citizens or Preston, Connecticut citizens, there are two very interesting names, many interesting names actually, but two in particular that caught my eye: Benedict Arnold and Benedict Arnold Jr. And um, at first, I saw these names, and I'm well aware of the fact, as some of you may well be, that there were many different men named Benedict Arnold over the years. The general being just one of them, and Benedict Arnold, the general, the trader, he was merely a teenager when these purchases were made, 14 years old. Um, but the fact remains that there are two signers, Benedict Arnold and Benedict Arnold Jr. And through researching the Benedict Arnold family, at this point about 99.9% sure that Benedict Arnold Jr. was the general, and that his father was an investor, uh, and probably in his son's name as well, in the original Delaware Company purchases that resulted in the Cushetunk settlement. And I've arrived at that through uh, uh, meticulous research into the Arnold family name. Just a couple of points about that. Benedict Arnold's mother is closely related to many of the other signers on the those Delaware Company deeds. So the Lothrop family, and the Lothrops are her relatives who actually take Benedict Arnold in when his father loses the family fortune, when he has to be taken out of boarding school. I'll give you a little background on that. I find this fascinating. Hopefully, you will as well. But Benedict Arnold originally he grows up in his early years as a member of a very prominent and wealthy family. His father's a successful businessman. His great grandfather, by the way, was governor of Rhode Island at one time. So the Arnold family's fairly prominent. And he grows up in a fairly wealthy family. They send him off to boarding school. He lives the life of an upper middle class youth. They expect that he'll go to Yale, and he will continue uh, to carry on the family name. But two of his siblings die from yellow fever, and his father takes that very hard, and he begins to drink excessively. Back in those days, they would call it, he begins to live a dissipative lifestyle. But basically, he becomes a drunk, and he drinks away the family fortune. And over the years, um, he begins to lose more and more of the family money. And eventually, Benedict Arnold has to be taken out of private school. And his mother's able to get some of her relatives, the Lothrops, who are they own a successful apothecary business that ships medical supplies, and eventually they become wealthy shipping medical supplies to the Continental Armory and whatnot. But she's able to get them to take Benedict Arnold in as an apprentice. But the point is that he grows up with this chip on his shoulder, and he resents the fact that his father has lost the family fortune, and that um, his destiny as a wealthy scion of a prominent family has been taken from him. And he's forced to live a completely different life. And so that's really one of the reasons why he has this. Many people who have studied the Arnold personality say that he grew up with this chip on his shoulder. He resents authority, et cetera, et cetera, all of which drives him um, to betray his country eventually. He takes everything as a personal affront. When his pay is late as an officer, he takes it personally. When he's not reimbursed for his expenses, he takes it personally. And so he blames it all on the country, and that's why he on Congress he eventually is more receptive. It's one of the reasons why he's more receptive to betraying his country. At any rate, this is a story that we're developing. Is the role that Benedict Arnold played in the early settlement of Cushetunk. And before I go, we wrap things up today, and I'll take questions. I also want to mention an event that we have coming up on April 26th. As some of you know, April of 1775 is really the beginning of the Revolutionary War. It's Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world. It's the ride of Paul Revere, and so we decided to commemorate uh, the Paul Revere ride and the beginning of hostilities in the Revolutionary War with a big event at Seminary Hill in Callicoon. We're going to celebrate, and this will sort of kick off the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War here in Sullivan County. We're calling the event "The British Are Coming," and it will entail a social hour, a dinner. We're going to have a dramatic reading by Oliver King, and if you've ever heard Oliver perform or seen him perform, you know how good he is. He's going to be reading the Longfellow poem, "The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere," and the afternoon and evening will be concluded with a play by the group History at Play. Boston-based group, Judith Colora. Some of you may have seen her at Fort Delaware last summer. She did a play about Deborah Sampson, who was a Revolutionary War, a woman who actually fought as a soldier in the Revolutionary War. Well, this year she's doing a play called Rendezvous with Rachel Revere, which is a recounting of Paul Revere's ride through the eyes of his wife, Rachel. What happened was when Paul Revere takes off on his midnight ride to warn the settlers in the region about the British advancement, the British military actually surrounds Boston and cuts them off. And so he's unable to return home. And his wife, Rachel, is left at home, cut off from communication. She doesn't know what has become of Paul Revere. Has he been captured or killed? And weeks go by that she's unaware of his fate. And so Judith Colora has written and performs this one woman play, which is the story of Paul Revere's ride through the eyes of his wife, Rachel Revere. So the event will be culminated with this one woman play, and she is terrific. If you got to see her as Deborah Sampson, you know how good she is. So tickets can be purchased on our website, thedelawarecompany.org. You can just go on the website, and if you scroll down to the headline that says the Delaware Company commemorates Paul Revere's ride, and just click on that, you'll be taken to a place where you can purchase your tickets. There's a limited number of tickets available, and they're going fast. So if you're interested, don't put off purchasing your tickets. So we look forward to a great event. And as I said, this will be really the kickoff of a years-long commemoration of the Revolutionary War. So that is my presentation. Again, the point being that this division in the settlement ends up actually in the demise of the settlement. It completely dissolves because of these divisions, and the repercussions continued for many years thereafter. So I'm going to close the presentation now and